Hello, and welcome back to Forgotten Ties. Some stories are born from a moment so small, so seemingly insignificant, that you almost miss it. They start with a whisper, a glance, a question you never thought you'd ask. But sometimes, that small moment is a crack in the dam, and what follows is a flood that changes everything you thought you knew about your life. This is one of those stories. It's a story about a woman named Elara, a woman who had built a life on a foundation of certainty, only to have it all crumble because of a single, shared scar. Elara was an architect, a woman who dealt in concrete, steel, and unshakable designs. Her life was as meticulously planned as the blueprints she drew. She had a sleek, minimalist apartment in the heart of Chicago, a partner named Liam who was a neurosurgeon with hands as steady as his demeanor, and a routine that she cherished. Every morning began with a precise pour-over coffee, followed by a brisk run along Lake Michigan, and then a day spent creating structures that would one day define the city's skyline. At 38, Elara believed she had mastered the art of her own destiny. She knew who she was, an only child, adopted at a young age by a loving, but emotionally distant, couple who had raised her to be self-sufficient and pragmatic. Her childhood was a series of well-ordered memories, punctuated by one vague but persistent shadow, a faded scar on her left wrist, a jagged line that she was told came from a fall off a bicycle when she was 5. She never thought much of it. It was simply part of her, a physical footnote to a life story she considered complete. The catalyst for this entire saga arrived not as a dramatic event, but as a quiet, mundane encounter in a place of great human commotion, a crowded hospital waiting room. Elara was there with Liam, who had just finished a grueling 12-hour surgery. She had brought him a thermos of his favorite tea and a simple sandwich. As she sat, waiting for him to finish his post-op rounds, a woman entered the waiting room and sat directly across from her. This woman was older, perhaps in her late 50s, with a face etched by both worry and resilience. Her hair, a striking shade of silver, was pulled back in a loose bun, and her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, fidgeting with a worn leather purse. Elara, ever the observer of human form and function, found her presence intriguing. The woman seemed to be carrying a weight that was almost visible. Their eyes met for a fleeting second, and then Elara's gaze drifted down, not to be impolite, but simply to take in the subtle details of the person across from her. That's when she saw it. As the older woman adjusted her purse, her left hand came into view. On her wrist was a scar. It wasn't just a scar, it was the scar. It was the exact same jagged line that resided on Elara's own wrist. The shape, the length, the faintness, it was an uncanny, impossible replica. Elara's breath hitched. She instinctively pulled her own sleeve down, a reflexive movement born of sudden, inexplicable panic. A silent, electric jolt shot through her. What were the odds? It was a simple question, but in that moment, it felt like the most profound mystery she had ever faced. The woman didn't seem to notice Elara's reaction. She continued to fidget, her eyes fixed on the hospital door. Elara, meanwhile, was no longer in the waiting room. She was lost in a vortex of memory and disbelief. The scar. She had always been told it was a bicycle accident, a simple childhood mishap. But seeing it on a stranger who felt strangely, hauntingly familiar, threw every one of those certainties into doubt. A small, nagging voice in the back of her mind, a voice she had long suppressed, began to scream. It spoke of a deeper connection, a possibility so terrifyingly beautiful she couldn't dare to name it. She had to know. Her pragmatic mind, the one that had built a life on logic and reason, demanded an explanation. As the woman started to rise, looking ready to leave, Elara felt an urgency that bordered on desperation. Her heart pounded against her ribs. She had to act. Without a second thought, she rose from her chair and walked toward the woman, her movements stiff, almost robotic. The woman turned, her silver eyes meeting Elara's once more, and for the first time, Elara noticed the subtle tremble in her hands, a shared vulnerability that transcended the simple coincidence of a scar. "Excuse me," Elara said, her voice a little shaky. I couldn't help but notice your scar. The words felt clumsy, inadequate. The woman's eyes widened slightly, her face a mask of guarded confusion. Elara pulled back her own sleeve, revealing the twin mark. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken questions, with a gravity that pulled their two worlds together, and it was in that silence that the first brick of Elara's meticulously built life began to crack. The woman, her name was Helen, didn't speak for a long moment. She simply stared at Elara's wrist, then back at her face, a slow realization dawning in her silver eyes. It wasn't confusion anymore. It was something deeper, a mix of disbelief and a profound, agonizing hope. I got this when I was a child, she finally whispered, her voice raspy with emotion. I fell off a tricycle. A red one. Elara's blood ran cold. The story was the same. The same detail, the same seemingly insignificant memory. Her parents had told her it was a bicycle, not a tricycle, but the core of the story, the fall, the age, the jagged scar, was an echo of her own. I was told I fell off a bicycle, Elara said, the words barely audible. At 5 years old. Just like you. An almost supernatural tension filled the air. Helen's hands, which had been trembling, were now frozen. My daughter, she said, her voice a little louder, a little stronger, as if she were testing the words. My daughter, she would be your age. She was taken, at 5 years old, from a park. Elara's world tilted on its axis. Taken, she asked, the single word a chasm of fear. Helen shook her head, a silent, painful gesture. Missing. The police said she must have wandered off, but I knew. I knew someone took her. I had her for 5 years, and she was gone. Her name was Evelyn. The name resonated somewhere in the deepest, most forgotten part of Elara's being, a hum of distant familiarity. But it was the other details that were a punch to the gut. The age. The circumstance. The scar. Elara had grown up with a sense of her own, neatly packaged story. A happy adoption, a well-adjusted life. But what if that story was a lie? What if it was a carefully constructed facade, built to hide a truth that was too painful, too dark to face? The thought was a monstrous thing, a predatory fear that clawed at her from the inside. She looked at Helen's eyes, brimming with unshed tears, and saw not a stranger, but a mirror reflecting a part of herself she had never known. I don't know what you're talking about, Elara said, her voice now a tight, desperate whisper, a futile attempt to push back against the tide of overwhelming information. I'm adopted. My parents, they're good people. They gave me a good life. I know, Helen said, her voice now imbued with a quiet certainty that was more unsettling than any shout. I saw the pictures. In the newspaper. When the news of her being missing went quiet. A week later, a small article. A local paper, not far from here. A couple had adopted a child. A little girl, 5 years old, with a scar on her wrist. The pictures were blurry, but the scar, that scar. Her voice trailed off, lost in the torment of a memory revisited. I contacted them. They said it was a misunderstanding. They said it wasn't my daughter. But I never believed them. The pieces of the puzzle, once scattered and seemingly unrelated, were now snapping into place with a terrifying click. The emotional distance of her adoptive parents, the way they had always discouraged her from looking into her past, their subtle but persistent anxiety whenever the topic of her adoption came up. It had always felt like a quirk of their personalities, a form of protectiveness. Now it felt like a deliberate act of concealment. Elara's carefully constructed world was not just cracking, it was shattering. What were your parents' names? Helen asked, her voice softer, almost pleading. Henry and Marianne. Elara responded automatically, her mind reeling. A look of pain and grim recognition crossed Helen's face. The same. Oh God. It was them. A single tear finally escaped, tracing a path through the weathered lines on her cheek. They denied it. They said they found you wandering alone and took you in. But they never told me about the scar. They never told me about the scar because they knew. They knew. The full weight of the revelation crashed down on Elara. Her entire life, the stable, logical, predictable existence she had so meticulously built was founded on a kidnapping. Her loving parents weren't her saviors, they were her captors. The people she had trusted, the people who had given her a name and a future, had stolen her from someone else. From this woman, this stranger with the silver hair and the same tired eyes as her. The raw, visceral pain of this realization was unlike anything she had ever experienced. It wasn't the kind of pain that came from a physical wound, it was the kind that tore at the very fabric of her identity. Who was she? Was she Elara the architect? Or was she Evelyn, the missing girl? Was she the child of a loving couple, or the victim of a monstrous deception? The questions swirled in her mind, a chaotic maelstrom of fear, anger, and betrayal. She looked at Liam's name on the hospital door, a symbol of the perfect life she had so carefully curated, and she felt a sense of profound shame. How could she tell him? How could she tell the man she loved that her entire existence was a lie? She couldn't. Not yet. She needed to know more. She needed proof. As she looked at Helen, the woman's face was a mixture of grief and a fragile joy, the joy of finally finding the answer she had sought for decades. But for Elara, it was only the beginning of a nightmare she never knew she was living. Elara stumbled back, a world of carefully built assumptions collapsing around her. She couldn't breathe. Her mind, so used to logical progression and structural integrity, was now a fractured mess of fragments. I have to go, she stammered, the words an escape route, a desperate attempt to run from this unbearable truth. She turned and fled, not looking back at the woman who was her mother. She didn't have a car, she just ran, the cold Chicago wind stinging her face as she tried to outrun the demons now chasing her. She needed to be alone. She needed to process this seismic shock to her reality. She ran until she couldn't anymore, her lungs burning, and she found herself on a secluded stretch of the lakefront, the waves crashing against the shore like the chaos in her mind. She pulled out her phone, her fingers hovering over the contact for Liam. How could she call him? What would she say? Hey, honey, remember my parents? The ones you love? They might have kidnapped me when I was 5. It was insane. It was a story you read in a newspaper, not one that happened to you. But the scar on her wrist felt real. The pain in her heart felt real. The next few days were a blur of sleepless nights and numb silence. Elara didn't go to work. She lied to Liam, telling him she had a terrible flu. He, ever the caring partner, brought her soup and medicine, fussing over her with a tenderness that only magnified her guilt. She watched him, his gentle eyes full of concern, and she felt a chasm widening between them. She was a different person now. The woman he loved had vanished, replaced by a ghost named Evelyn. The lies she told him, the perfect facade she maintained, felt like a betrayal. Driven by a desperate need for answers, she started digging. She couldn't bring herself to confront her parents directly. The fear was too great. What would they say? Would they confess? Or would they deny it all, gaslight her into believing she was crazy? She decided to look for concrete proof. She flew to her parents' house in a small suburban town in Wisconsin, unannounced. The house, the same one she had grown up in, was a time capsule of a life she now questioned. The framed photos on the mantelpiece, a smiling, rosy-cheeked little girl. She looked at them with a new eye, searching for the ghost of Evelyn in the cheerful face of Elara. She started in the attic, a place she had been forbidden to go as a child. It was a dusty, forgotten space, filled with old furniture and boxes of holiday decorations. In a corner, tucked behind a heavy wardrobe, she found a small, unmarked wooden chest. Her heart pounded in her chest as she knelt down and opened it. Inside were her baby photos, her first report cards, and a folded piece of paper. It was a yellowed newspaper clipping. She unfolded it with shaking hands. The headline, in a small, provincial font, read, "Local child, Evelyn Reed, missing from community park." Underneath was a blurry, black-and-white photo of a small girl with a similar scar on her wrist. The article described the frantic search, the heartbroken parents, the dead end of the investigation. Her mother and father's names weren't mentioned, but the details were too specific to be a coincidence. Then, she found another item in the chest. A small, hand-stitched doll, its face worn and faded. It was the same doll she had been told was a special gift from her parents, a toy she had cherished and kept all her life. But attached to its tiny, threadbare dress was a small, embroidered tag. The letters were faded, but still legible. E.R. Evelyn Reed. The truth was no longer a possibility, it was a certainty. Her parents, her beloved Henry and Marianne, were not her saviors. They were the perpetrators of a crime that had stolen a child from her birth mother and twisted a lifetime into a web of deceit. The love they had shown her felt like a cage, a gilded prison built on the sorrow of another family. The feeling of betrayal was so deep, so profound, that it was a physical ache. Every "I love you," every tender hug, every Christmas gift, they were all tainted, corrupted by the monstrous lie at their core. She felt a wave of nausea, a dizzying sense of disorientation. She had spent her entire life building a home, a career, a relationship on a foundation that wasn't hers. Her dreams, her aspirations, her entire identity were now in question. The architect who built solid, unshakable structures now stood in the ruins of her own life. She had to confront them. She had to know why. With the newspaper clipping and the doll clutched in her hands, she descended the stairs, ready to face the two people who had given her everything and taken away more than she could ever comprehend. The living room was quiet, bathed in the soft glow of the afternoon sun. Henry was reading the newspaper, and Marianne was knitting a scarf, a picture of domestic tranquility. A tranquility that was about to be shattered. Elara stood there, the weight of the doll and the clipping in her hands a physical manifestation of the truth she carried. "I know," she said, her voice strained, a raw wound of emotion. "I know about Evelyn." Henry's newspaper lowered slowly. Marianne's knitting needles clattered to the floor. The picture of blissful ignorance was gone, replaced by a mask of grim resignation and unspeakable sorrow. "How?" Henry asked, his voice a low rumble. "How did you find out?" "I met her mother," Elara said, her gaze fixed on Marianne. "In a hospital waiting room. We have the same scar." Marianne's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes welling with tears. "Oh, Elara." "Don't call me that," she said, the words a knife. "My name is Evelyn. And I want to know why. Why did you do it? Why did you take me?" The story that followed was a slow, painful unraveling of a lifetime of guilt. Henry and Marianne had been a young couple, desperately wanting a child, but unable to conceive. After years of failed IVF and heartache, they had felt a crushing sense of despair. One day, they were at a park, and they saw a little girl, a vibrant, happy child playing on a tricycle. She had been left alone for just a moment, her mother distracted by a phone call. In a moment of madness, of a desperate, selfish urge they couldn't control, they had taken her. It was a spur-of-the-moment decision that had haunted them every single day since. They hadn't planned to hurt anyone. They just wanted a family. They had changed her name, forged birth certificates, and moved to a new town to create a new life. They had given her everything, every opportunity, every ounce of love they had, but it was all rooted in a single, monstrous act. "We were wrong," Marianne sobbed, her body shaking. "We know we were wrong. But we loved you, Elara. We truly loved you. You were our world." "But I wasn't yours to take," Elara said, the words heavy with the weight of her stolen childhood. "You stole me. You stole me from a mother who spent her life looking for me. You stole my name, my life. And you let me believe it was all perfect." The truth was a double-edged sword. She had a loving childhood. The hugs and the kisses were real. The support and the encouragement were real. But it was a stolen love, a stolen life. The pain of the lie was now greater than the joy of the memories. Elara left the house, leaving the newspaper clipping and the doll on the table, a silent testament to the life she had just discovered and the one she had just lost. The reunion with her birth mother, Helen, was a torrent of raw, unfiltered emotion. The two women, so long separated, embraced in a moment that was both beautiful and heart-wrenching. They found that they were more alike than they could have imagined, not just the scar, but the way they held their coffee cups, their love for art, their quiet melancholy. But the years lost were a chasm that could never be filled. Evelyn and Helen, mother and daughter, began the slow, painful process of getting to know each other, rebuilding a bond that had been severed by a single act of selfishness. The rest of the story is still being written. Elara, or Evelyn, is navigating a new reality. She told Liam everything, and he, with a love that was deeper and more profound than she had ever imagined, stood by her side, a rock in the storm. The police reopened the case, but what could they do? The perpetrators were her parents, and the victim was now an adult, reunited with her birth family. There was no easy resolution, no dramatic arrest. Just the quiet, complicated aftermath of a truth revealed. This story is a reminder that the world is full of invisible threads, connecting people in ways we can't always see or understand. Sometimes, those threads are woven with love, and sometimes they are twisted with betrayal. But they are always there, waiting to be found. The scar on Elara's wrist was a map, a compass pointing her to a truth that was both painful and liberating. It was the mark of a past she never knew, and the key to a future she is only just beginning to build. Thank you for joining us on this journey. If you found this story as compelling as we did, please don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Forgotten Ties, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next story of lost connections and found truths.